How well do you know Australia's income tax system? You've probably heard of tax brackets, and you might be aware that the former Liberal government made some changes to them. Here's what they looked like before the pandemic. Here's what they look like now. And here's what they'll be in 3 years' time. But it's actually more complicated than this. There are a number of levies and offsets that modify these brackets. You might have heard of the Medicare levy, not the Medicare levy surcharge that you can avoid by paying for private health insurance. The Medicare levy is a separate thing that everyone pays. So let's add it onto our brackets. You might also have heard of the low and middle income tax offsets. This was the $1,080 that the government was promising us a few years ago. So let's add that in too. Now this is starting to look pretty confusing and complicated. It goes up and down all over the place. Did you know you pay a higher marginal tax rate at $25,000 than you do at $45,000? And we haven't even scratched the surface on the conditional levies and offsets that make this even more complicated. Surely there's a better way. Well, that's what I thought, and I've come up with a solution. I call it the tax curve. The tax curve is a smooth approximation of our current system of tax brackets. This means no sharp increases in tax rates as your income goes up. Plus, it's indexed to wages, which means it completely eliminates bracket creep. The other big advantage of the tax curve is it increases tax progressivity. The former government's tax changes are regressive. See how the red line is flat for a long time in the middle? This means that wealthier people get more of a tax cut than everyone else. The tax curve is the opposite. It's progressive, which means low and middle income earners benefit more than wealthy people. At this point, you're probably wondering how the tax curve actually affects the amount of tax you'll pay. So let's take a look. Now the previous graph showed marginal tax rates, while this graph shows how much actual tax you'll pay under each system. There's two main things to point out here. First, have a look at the red line. See how it dips at the end compared to the others? That's what I was talking about before. Wealthy people will benefit way more than the rest of us. If you ever hear the media talk about the Stage 3 tax cuts, this is what they're referring to. Next, let's take a look at what the tax curve does. That's the blue line. You can see it dips quite significantly at the start. That means a substantial tax cut for low and middle income earners. The other thing to note is that it goes back up towards the green and yellow lines near the end, which means that higher income earners will pay about as much tax as they already do now. It can be a bit hard to make out the detail in this graph though, so let's zoom in and have a closer look. So this is the same graph as before, but I've recentered it so that the tax curve is at 0. This means the values you're looking at are the changes in what you would pay under the tax curve system. A positive value on this graph means you'll pay less tax under the tax curve, and a negative value means you'll pay more. You can see here that the tax curve is a big win for middle income earners. You could save over $5,000 a year. And let's take a look at those Stage 3 tax cuts. That's the red line. You might remember a few years ago when it was being debated in Parliament, people were talking about $11,000 a year handout for millionaires. It's a pretty crazy idea when you see it up close like this, huh? So in summary, the tax curve has some major benefits over our current system. It increases progressivity, which means it benefits middle income earners the most. It's indexed, which means it won't need to be adjusted in future as wages go up. And more importantly, it permanently eliminates bracket creep. The tax curve is not without its challenges, but even these have their upsides. It might seem complicated at first, but it's actually a lot simpler than it looks. If you were able to read the graphs before, then you've already understood how it works. Our current system, on the other hand, is actually a lot more complicated than it first appears, as we saw earlier. The other challenge is that a major tax cut for middle income earners would cause a significant drop in overall tax revenue. But income tax is nearly half of all government revenue in Australia, one of the highest in the world. The tax curve could provide a perfect opportunity to shift Australia's tax base away from income tax and towards other sources. So thank you for watching, and I hope you can see how the tax curve would be an excellent reform for Australia's taxation system.